I'm Dom Nichols in the hot seat today, and this is Ukraine the latest. Today we discuss the missile strikes across Ukraine, hear from a former British soldier about his efforts to train Ukrainian troops, and I give a readout of what it was like for us being in Rome with the Defence Secretary as President Zelensky arrived in the UK and started the jet ball rolling.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Putin's war in Ukraine has destabilized energy markets the world over.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Friday, the 10th of February, day 352. And with me to talk Starlink and cyber attacks, we have senior tech reporter Gareth Caulfield, and we're joined by Daniel Ridley, who set up the Trident Defence Initiative. I started with the latest news from Ukraine over the past 24 hours. Now, Zaporizhia, the town in the sort of centre of the country on the Dnieper River, that has suffered its heaviest rocket attack since the war began. 17 missiles hit in just an hour. There have been other strikes across the country, including Kyiv. Ukrainian Air Force is saying that it shot down 61 of 71 cruise missiles. And Yuri Enyat, who's the Air Force spokesperson, he told Ukrainian television that Ukrainian air defences had shot down 5 of 7 drones and 5 out of 6 caliber missiles that I think the context there was heading towards Kyiv, but I'm not exactly sure. However, he also said that Russia had launched at least 35 anti-aircraft S-300 missiles, which Ukraine's air defences were unable to shoot down, and borderline, I'm not sure they have the capability to shoot down S-300s, and they were aimed at Kharkiv and Zaporizhia regions. Now, what was the effect? So several high-voltage facilities across Ukraine were hit, so Russia's still trying to attack the critical national infrastructure. That comment came from Ukraine's state grid operator Ukrenergo. And then Valery Zaluzhny, who is the head of Ukraine's armed forces, said that two caliber cruise missiles launched from the Black Sea had entered Moldovan airspace and then flown over Romanian airspace before entering Ukraine. Now, as one of our listeners, Paul, thanks Paul, Paul said, if the missile had gone over Romania, if that story is true, shouldn't that trigger some form of statement from NATO? And yes, you're absolutely right, Paul. So I gave NATO a ring, spoke to one of the spokesmen over there, and they said the story was false and that Romania were literally just about to put out a press statement. And sure enough, a few minutes later, Romanian MOD did put out a statement which said the following, quote, "The aerial surveillance system of the Romanian Air Force detected on Friday, February the 10th, an aerial target launched from the Black Sea from a ship of the Russian Federation near the Crimean Peninsula, most likely a cruise missile, which evolved in the airspace of Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, and re-entered the Ukrainian airspace without intersecting at any time the airspace of Romania." The statement goes on, "The closest point of the target's trajectory to Romania's airspace was recorded by the radar systems approximately 35 kilometres northeast of the border. The Romanian authorities applied all standard procedures from the moment that the target launch was detected until the situation was fully clarified. In addition, at 10:38, 2 MiG-21 Lancer aircraft of the Romanian Air Force from the Air Police Combat Service under NATO command, which were at that time on an exercise flight, were redirected to the northern area of Romania to supplement the reaction options. After about 2 minutes, the situation was clarified and the 2 aircraft resumed their original mission. The Romanian Air Force constantly monitors, in cooperation with allied forces, the national airspace and the area in the vicinity," unquote. Bit long, but I wanted to cover everything there. So, yes, Romania acting in combat service under NATO command. It would have been very serious had these missiles flown through NATO airspace. There undoubtedly would have been some response, probably just a statement, I would have thought, maybe a bolstering of the air policing as we have seen in recent months. But that came directly from the Romanian Air Force spokesperson. Now, Moldova has said it's going to summon Russia's ambassador after the suggestion that the missile went across their airspace, but that is an ongoing situation. Now, elsewhere, let's look at the Donbass. So back in the centre of the country, or the central east of the country, since Tuesday, the reports that Wagner Group has pushed about 2 or 3 kilometres further west from the northern outskirts of Bakhmut, the town there that's been fought over for months. And Wagner are now thought to hold a lot of the countryside around the M03 road, which runs northwest towards Slovyansk, about 30 k's away. Now, there's 2 main roads into Bakhmut, which are the supply lines for the Ukrainian forces in there. The M03 runs, as I say, from the town of Bakhmut northwest, and it looks as if Wagner are in or around it, but able to control that corridor. Now I want to lift you out. Let's go 100 kilometres southwest. 100 kilometres southwest to the town of Vuhledar, which is, as I say, 100 k's southwest of Bakhmut, and it's about 20 k's west-southwest, really, of Donetsk city. Now, Russian units there have made advances around the western edge. They started major offensive operations there in late January, but it's looking at a much tougher fight for Russia. There are reports of very heavy casualties because it's thought that Vuhledar is being fought by Russia using very inexperienced troops. And in one failed assault, it's assessed that around 30 mainly intact vehicles were abandoned. That last one there came from the UK's Defence Intelligence report for today. So Vuhledar is a much harder fight. Now, linked to that, hold that thought for one moment. Let's have a look at the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, US-based think tank, very credible think tank. They're saying that Russian military command may be shifting away from its reliance on Wagner. And they're saying that the Russia's Federal Penitentiary Service figures show decreases in the Russian prison population stabilised between November last year and January this year. Remember, we saw Yevgeny Prigozhin, the boss of Wagner, going round the jails or recruiting convicts. And so that effort is thought to have slowed, if not stopped, and therefore, hence these figures are sort of flatlining. Now, that phenomenon of fewer convicts leaving prisons is consistent with the overall trend of conventional Russian troops slowly replacing Wagner forces around Bakhmut. Yevgeny Prigozhin said yesterday Wagner had, quote, completely stopped, unquote, recruiting prisoners, and said that all obligations are being fulfilled for those currently fighting for Wagner. Now, those obligations, if you remember, they've been promised pardons for all their crimes they've been promised pardons for their crimes for 6 months service in the military, or in the Wagner group. Now, between us, what that equates is if you're still alive in 6 months' time, then you have your crimes pardoned. So, questionable whether that's a good deal or not. Now, Prigozhin also claimed, a bit wobbly on this one, he claimed that over 10 million Americans have applied to join Wagner. Say that again. 10 million Americans have applied to join Wagner. I'm a bit sceptical. In fact, I'm sceptical about everything that Yevgeny Prigozhin says, to be honest. He still hasn't taken me up on that offer of lunch. But anyway, so what I'm thinking is, this is my assessment now, I think the relative success around Bakhmut has been because the Wagner forces have been fighting there, motivated, if you want to think of it that way, by having their pardons in 6 months' time. But those attacks, I was speaking to Ben Wallace in Rome, as I said, over the last couple of days. We were talking about these, and he characterised it as, quote, human wave meat grinder type attacks. Right. So we've said this before, that they just seem to be really unsophisticated, just running at the Ukrainian positions, trying to find the weaker areas, which they can then backfill with more experienced Russian soldiers. So that seems to have been the case. Now, if the regular army is taking over, partly because General Gerasimov is now in charge of the whole thing, and he's got a long-running power struggle with Prigozhin, but also because Wagner is depleted, I wonder if that northern sector, where there is this relative success around Bakhmut, is that northern sector going to start stumbling as the regular Russian army is doing in Vuhledar? Right, I'm going to take a little pause there. I want to have a chat with Gaz. I see you in the room, Gaz. Great to have you back. Firstly, can we turn to Starlink? There's a story today that Elon Musk's SpaceX, that owns Starlink, is said to have restricted access to the system, accusing Kyiv of weaponizing the tech. And Gwynne Shotwell, she's the president of SpaceX and the most senior exec after Elon Musk, she said Ukrainians have leveraged it in ways that were unintentional and not part of any agreement. We know the military is using them for comms, and that's okay, but our intent was never to have them use it for offensive purposes. We'll do everything we can to make sure. Oh, sorry, stumbled straight into my next quote there. So it looks like SpaceX is going to turn off Starlink. I asked Ben Wallace about this in Rome, and he said to me, "We'll do everything we can to make sure that if there is a loss, that was his emphasis. You can tell I've done this before. If there is a loss of Starlink, that it isn't mission critical to the Ukrainians," which I think I thought was a very interesting comment. So I said, "Would you be willing to step in and provide the service if Starlink has gone?" And he said, "Yes, absolutely." So I thought that was a really interesting exchange with Ben Wallace. So Gaz, sorry, a bit of a download there. Great to have you back. We'll talk about ransomware in a moment, but can you just come in and give us what is Starlink and why is it so important to Ukraine?
Right, so Starlink is a satellite communication system. What it is essentially Elon Musk, SpaceX, has launched thousands of satellites into Earth orbit, and they are used to provide internet connectivity. The ground component of that is a small portable dish, a bit like a Sky dish if you're in the UK. You can set it up remotely anywhere, point it at the sky, and that gives you internet connectivity. Now, that's really valuable to the Ukrainians because Russia has made a habit, a specific point of carrying out airstrikes and on mobile phone masts and destroying telecommunications infrastructure as a way of trying to cripple Ukraine. I think the pod guys have talked about that in previous episodes at great length, so I won't dwell on that for too long. But as a result of that, the Ukrainians have found that Starlink absolutely meets their needs. It's portable, it's easily deployable, and the backhaul is extremely difficult for Russia to target without triggering further consequences. Now, Ms. Shotwell's comments, which Dom's just alluded to there, are potentially concerning, actually, because if the Ukrainians were to lose access to Starlink, that would put a serious dent in their ability to communicate, to run their civil society, but also to be able to do things like military command and control for the essential comms that they need to keep on fighting the war. And it's not the first time that Starlink and SpaceX executives have made, should we say, ambiguous comments about it. Musk himself has said in the past that he was questioning the amount of money that was being run up on the service after he initially offered it to Ukraine pro bono. And I think he was eventually leaned on by sources in the States to continue doing that good thing. Now, it's an open question as to whether that means the Department of Defence are specifically funding it themselves. They may well be. I have to confess, I wouldn't want to make a statement on that either way because I haven't checked. But to bring it back onto point there, the concern for the Ukrainians is that if Starlink is switched off or otherwise there's something put in the way that prevents them from making full use of it as they are at the present, then that brings the question of what can you introduce to replace it? Well, the Russians have been and are continuing to target mobile phone masts and internet infrastructure, data centres, all those types of places. And despite Western support, obviously, you need mobile phone masts, you need those physical cables, you need those links and nodes to keep the telecoms infrastructure going, and those are physical things that can still be destroyed and targeted today. So what do we have in our back pocket to sort of reassure the Ukrainians? Well, we do have, I think we mentioned there, OneWeb, which was formerly owned by the British government. Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, I think has told Dom that he thinks that we've actually divested it fully now. There is a live issue at the moment about its ownership and control, but that's a very, very economic, very almost political dimension to it. OneWeb's equipment is not particularly suited to Starlink-style applications. It tends to be quite large and heavy and bulky. They advertise that as a sort of something you can put on perhaps a lorry flatbed or on a more substantial vehicles, such as ships and so on. So that's not the best of potential replacements for Starlink's capabilities. But again, we're assured by Mr. Wallace that there are things that Britain can do. I mean, that could be as simple as supplying satellite communication phones. That could be as something of that type of nature. Certainly, we've got plenty of that kind of kit, and I'm sure we do have experts available who can talk about that. But in terms of a potential Starlink shutdown or a potential replacement for Starlink, it's not looking particularly good. I mean, it is obviously a good thing that Starlink is continuing its support for now, and certainly I think everybody speaking and listening here today will be keen to maintain that as the situation. But in the face of Starlink running up costs to provide the service, which are perhaps not being recouped, there is an issue there about keeping that support going and potentially having something available to deploy as a replacement or to supplement or augment Starlink. And they have raised concerns. I mean, Gwynne Shotwell has talked about the weaponization of it by Kiev and has strongly hinted that that's something that they would not like them to be doing. And from a commercial point of view, you can see that because that exposes their equipment to direct Russian attacks, as has actually happened previously. I think last year in the war, there was an attack against a cyber attack by Russia against some communications facilities, which resulted in wind farms in Germany going offline as it knocked out the vital internet comms that they use to keep themselves online and functioning. So there is that issue there as well of Starlink being relied on by the Ukrainians for purposes which Starlink's operators and deployers are not perhaps comfortable with because it brings them into the firing line. So again, that is something where we need to sit back and consider what else is available to us as the West. What can we do not only to reassure Starlink and shore them up, but also to ensure that if something happens, either as a direct result of a Russian, for example, cyber attack, or worse, or something more kinetic than a cyber attack, that there is an ability to put something in place to say, hey, we can keep the Ukrainians online, we can keep them functioning, we can keep their civil society going, as well as whatever military uses the Ukrainians might be finding for this internet connectivity. It is worth noting, I don't think the Ukrainians have actually commented on the Starlink situation or Ms. Shotwell's comments about the Ukrainian and Kiev's uses of it, but it has been fairly resilient to Russian hacking attempts so far as we know anyway. So there is that sort of happy notes to end on, that for now it continues, and for now the Ukrainians are still able to use Starlink and keep it going. Yeah. Does that sort of cover the area there, Dom? Have I given us a good workable summary to be going on with?
That's brilliant. Thanks, Gaz. Appreciate that. Now, into your area of expertise fully, let's get deep and dirty with cyber attacks and ransomware. Can you just bring us back up to speed on what has happened, why we've not really seen a huge amount of cyber, didn't mean for my voice to go very high there, but yeah, cyber attacks from Russia. Why might that be? But we have seen ransomware in recent weeks. So if you could just dial us back in there, please.
Yes, the ransomware situation. Now, the most newsy thing that's occurred was UK declaring financial sanctions on 7 Russian ransomware hackers. Now, this was announced by the Foreign Office yesterday, and it specifically names these 7 individuals and says that they are responsible for carrying out ransomware attacks against the UK, and that they have been involved in extorting tens of millions of pounds from British businesses. Just as a quick recap for the listeners, ransomware is a type of computer virus, essentially, where what happens is the people deploying it, so they'll pick a company, they'll target it, they'll get their malicious software into that company's IT networks, and it then scrambles all the files within that network. And it then flashes up a message saying, all your files have been encrypted, send us very large sums of money in cryptocurrencies, and we faithfully promise that once you've sent us that money, we will unlock it and we'll give you back access to your networks in return for this ransom payment. Now, that's got quite a strong Ukrainian dimension that I don't think is really appreciated much by the wider world, partly because on the technical side, ransomware is actually very useful as a military weapon of war because it is software that is designed to be silently infiltrated into a target's networks to disable them, or with some slight modifications, destroy them. And we've seen the Ukrainian Cyber Defence Agency, the SSCIP, the State Special Service for the State Service of Special Communications and Information Protection of Ukraine, that's their cyber defense agency, has talked in the past quite a lot about wiper ransomware. So instead of flashing up a ransom demand, it in fact just goes in there and is used to destroy networks. It deletes and scrambles everything, and there is no possibility of recovering it or paying large sums of money to plead with someone to bring back everything that's just been lost. But the other side of this one as well is that prior to the war, there was an awful lot of cross-border stuff going on between Ukraine and Russia when it came to ransomware gangs. Now, a lot of ransomware activity is concentrated in what you might describe as Russian-speaking nations. And it was known that there were, and indeed still are to this day, ransomware criminals operating from within Ukraine and from within Russia, and were even members of the same gangs and were actually sort of working side by side, cheek by jowl on their widespread extortion campaigns directed against the West. And what happened when war broke out was extremely interesting, certainly to the cybersecurity industry, because in one high-profile case, there was a gang called Conti who have been involved in extorting hundreds of millions from Western businesses. And a Conti member from Ukraine, once the invasion, once the Russian tanks had rolled across the border, said, "Look, I'm not going to put up with this. This is an outrage. Even by my standards, this is an outrage." And he took all of the internal chats and communications from the gang and he dumped them all online. And he said to the wider cybersecurity world, "Look at this. This is exactly how Conti operates. Here's all the internal details you could possibly need to know to track it down, to neutralise them, to identify the operators, and hopefully deploy some sort of sanctions against them." So bringing it back to the UK sanctions that were announced this week, what we're seeing here is more of an attempt to clamp down on these ransomware criminals and to essentially to target them, to put them personally into the spotlight and say, "We know who you are, we know what you're doing." And the ability to do that, and also I think the Foreign Office has suggested that these guys are taking their direction from the Russian intelligence agency, so they are in fact acting as in my view, in my personal view, you could describe them as acting as a military unit or a paramilitary unit that has its targets selected by the Russian state, by the Russian intelligence agencies themselves. So, yeah, it's good to be able to sort of bring these criminals into the limelight and say, no longer are you going to hide in the shadows, and no longer are you going to be able to sit there and say, I'm hiding behind my anonymous internet username and my hard-to-trace cryptocurrencies. We know your name, we know your age, we've got your mugshots. You're going to be unable to continue operating in the way that you do. And in a very small way, this is actually denting, I suspect, the Russian ability to keep carrying out these cyber attacks. Because ultimately, these people are not members of a formal Russian military unit, these ransomware hackers. They're not people who are within what you might call the protection of the Russian state. They are not completely insulated from the consequences of their actions in a legal way. And it may well be the case that some of them are now sitting there thinking, hell's bells, I'm not as anonymous as I thought I was. They know who I am. If I ever travel abroad outside of Russia again, I may find myself being arrested and extradited to the UK or to the US and facing years or decades in prison as a result. And it's this ability that we have in the West to impose those financial sanctions, to freeze bank accounts, to get hold of overseas assets, to put out port alerts, arrest warrants in place. It's that ability to put that chilling effect on these individuals, which has, and admittedly, it is a small effect. It is a small effect. It's not as immediate as dropping a bomb, or it's not as immediate as a police raid and rounding them all up in one fell swoop. But there is evidence out there to suggest that over time, the impact of these sanctions has slowly degraded these gangs' ability to operate, to recruit new members, and to generally keep on posing the threat that they do to the West and also to Ukraine. And ultimately, depriving the Russians of their ready access to these types of online criminals, slowing them down, getting the, if you can put it this way, the best online criminal minds to think, nah, we'll just quietly fade away, thanks very much. That, I think, is a win. That, in my view, is a good positive outcome. It's a small step. It's not a killer blow, as it were, but it is, I think, a good positive development to see that kind of action being taken by the West.
Thanks, Gaz. And in terms of a collective response from the West or the external supporters for Ukraine, or let's go back a step. Is it possible to have a kind of collective response in the similar way that we watch the debate over conventional weapons, or is the realms of cyber and the depth you have to be to have the effect you've just described? You're really only talking Five Eyes, and then you're probably only talking GCHQ, NSA, that kind of level. So is there similar collaboration or coordination, do you think, in this side of the fight?
I absolutely believe that there is. Traditionally, what happens when cyber sanctions are announced is that the Five Eyes and usually the major EU countries and the bloc itself will sort of get together behind the scenes ahead of time and say, right, we've identified these particular ransomware criminals or gangs. We're going to put sanctions on them. Will you join us in doing that? And what we tend to see is that these, all of these Western countries, the Five Eyes plus the EU, tend to act in lockstep on these sanctions. So we do tend to normally see that there is a sort of collective effort there to bring everyone together into the fold and say, right, we're going to go ahead and do this now. and we're going to all act together to make sure that there is, certainly within the Western sphere of influence, nowhere for these guys to sort of wriggle away and being able to get away from that. I think I would need to go and just check very carefully before I say something which may or may not be accurate, but I do believe that we have seen coordinated action on this one from the US and from Brussels as well. So, yeah, actually, when it comes to cyber sanctions and that type of cyber relevant activity, it is actually easier in many ways to take action than it is to discuss, for example, support in terms of heavy armour or jets for Ukraine.
Thanks, guys. And final question, if I may, doing Telegraph's bit for public service here. Anyone listening who is just, this is all a bit. This can be very murky and very worrying. We talk about phishing emails and all the rest of it, and it's very easy to get lost in it and just sort of think, oh my God, there's nothing I can do. What can we as individuals do? He says, having been hacked last year by the Russians. But anyway, what can we do as individuals to better protect or to best protect ourselves? There's just a couple of things we can do sort of right now, or things to hold in mind. What would you advise to protect ourselves from this kind of stuff?
Happily, it's all very, very simple, straightforward stuff that you can do to protect yourself. Number one, have some kind of antivirus installed, not only on your computer, but on your mobile phones, your tablets. Have some sort of built-in protection there that's scanning the files you're doing. When you're receiving emails, you're opening emails, clicking on links, anything like that, stop and think. Has somebody sent you an attachment out of the blue? Why have they sent you an attachment out of the blue? Have they themselves been hacked? Are you being targeted? Even if it's a friendly name or somebody you know well and they've suddenly sent you something that doesn't look quite right, just pause and think. If you can, pick up the phone, get hold of them, say, hello, did you send me a link to some random thing the other day? Ask those questions. I think suspicious is too strong a way of putting it. Be sceptical. What was it? Trust but verify, as Ronald Reagan put it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Gaz. Much appreciated. Now, I would like to welcome Dan. I linked an article that you did with Colin Freeman, or for which Colin Freeman interviewed you on February the 2nd. I linked it in my Twitter post about this episode of Ukraine the Latest. And in that article, you talked about how and why you set up the Trident Defence Initiative. But before we get into that and your time in Ukraine, can you just tell us a little bit about your background, your time in the British Army? But welcome, Dan.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Dominic and Gareth, for having me on and arranging this. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, so I initially joined the British Army in around 2012, the early part of 2012. And I went on to serve 4 years in the Princess of Wales Royal Regiment in the infantry, but I specialised in languages, so Arabic and Pashto. And then I served 4 years there, and around 2015, I began to work as a volunteer medic in various other places such as Iraq, Syria, Myanmar, and Colombia also.
Brilliant. So then, why, where, how, and when Ukraine? Why and where? How did you join the Ukrainian military, or what's the? Can you bring us into this bit of geography and history, please?
That's correct. Yeah, in 2019, I moved out to Ukraine and I joined the Ukrainian Marine Corps, specifically 36th Brigade, where I served 3 years. 2 of those years was involved in what was known as the anti-terrorist operations, or the joint services areas, and that was effectively the front line prior to February the 24th. So that was the separatist conflict and I believe, openly confirmed by Russia now, their involvement in that conflict, including the annexation of Crimea.
Now, I believe you settled in Bucha, a name that has terrible resonance with us today. Can you talk us through the first few months of the war? I believe you set up a makeshift hospital in your basement. Can you tell us about that and what was happening? Paint us a picture in those first few the first few months.
Yeah, that's correct. I actually returned to Ukraine from a small vacation in the UK, as I was on vacation from the military at the time, and I returned back to Ukraine on February the 23rd. I have lived in Bucha for the last, the entire time that I've been in Ukraine, so coming up to 4 years now. And obviously quite, as you said, an infamous place now due to the sort of crimes that were committed there and the discoveries that were made after the liberation. Yeah, very traumatic time. We woke up very early in the morning, I think between 0500, 0600. Phone call from my girlfriend at the time, her father, saying, I couldn't overhear the conversation, but, could tell there was something up. I open up live UA map, and I think one of the first videos I was greeted by was the Russian tank crashing through the Ukrainian block post on the Crimean bridge connecting Crimea to mainland Ukraine. And then it really just started the initial first 2 weeks that almost blurred together. But as the Russians, gradually made their way closer to Bucha and ultimately captured it, I was unable to link up my battalion themselves, as they were in Mariupol at the time, and were subsequently captured during the capture of Mariupol as a whole. So I was ordered to sort of survive, essentially. Most of my background has been medical, so I'd established with what little medical equipment I had at my house at the time, a hospital in my basement, sort of minor surgeries, trauma injuries, and even issuing out chronic medicine. And I was responsible for around 300 to 400 people that decided to remain in Bucha at the time. There was a lot of confusion at the beginning. People weren't sure, could you leave? Should you leave, etc. That fog of war that we already know. Yeah, we just sort of went through that first 2 weeks. I think after the second or third day, we'd lost gas, power, internet, everything. So there wasn't really much to go in the way of communications and everything. And the Russians actually captured Bucha as a whole during the time there. We weren't really sure if we could even leave. The information coming from the Russians that men would not be able to leave on any green corridors. Then we eventually found out that we could leave, and I'd make my way in an evacuation corridor as a civilian, because I was a non-combatant at the time, working as a medic with my family. And we'd transited through multiple Russian block posts. I'm a believer of the truth, and the Russians that I encountered them were the cream of the crop in regards to the Russian military. It was the airborne units and special forces units, and they'd stopped us at multiple block posts. They'd searched our vehicles, very minor questioning, didn't check documents, and I think that was my saving grace, as I only had my British passport. And we eventually made it back to Kiev. After that, where I stand now, I'm currently in Kharkiv. I then went on to set up Trident Defence Initiative.
Yeah, I'd like to move on to that in just one moment. But just before we do, can I just ask you, as you were leaving Bucha, we heard reports from elsewhere around the country that men of fighting age or military age males were being searched for tattoos to describe any kind of military affiliation. Did that happen to you? And secondly, you describe, dare I say, a professional outfit that you came up against or came through the Russian, as you went through the Russian lines. Can you tell us with your military experience, how did you know that they were, that you put them into that category straight away? I mean, how are they carrying themselves? How are they carrying their weapons? What was the state of their kit? What were the signs that you as a soldier look for to say, actually, this bunch are, like I say, small p professional? But first of all, the tattoos.
Yeah, so I think what the reports that were coming out about that, I know a few individuals, civilians that had made it out of Mariupol at that time, and it seemed the majority of those reports were coming from Mariupol, and with its association to Azov Battalion and other sort of infamous units, in the Western media and within Russia themselves. It seemed most of the checks for tattoos, I wouldn't say all of them. I wasn't in every single city at the same time, but the publicized checks for things like that were happening predominantly in Mariupol. We didn't experience anything like that in the Kiev area, specifically Bucha. Moving on to obviously the Russians that we encountered as we left Bucha. As you know, as a military man yourself, you're very pressed if you're going to see, convoys of tanks lined up on the road with the development of drones and more advanced aviation. Normally things are hidden, and it's very densely forested around Kiev. So there wasn't a huge sign of Russians. There was a huge sign of their presence. Tank tracks on the ground. The streets were littered with civilian vehicles that had been shot up. Some still with bodies inside of them, unfortunately. But there wasn't a huge presence of the Russians that you'd expect us. As we transited through the first block post, we came around a corner and we'd seen around 150 meters down the road, Russian BMP, a bunch of troops sat on top of it, and a small sort of block post set up. So we stopped about 100 meters back, and I assume the commander sort of waved us forward. They didn't stop us at this one. They pushed us straight through. But as we went down, obviously going very, very slowly past them, I looked out to the window to the right, and there was a young Russian soldier, very, very young, almost, looking 15, 16, not saying that he was, but he looked like that. He was in the little block post, and we sort of locked eyes for a second, and he looked almost as confused as I was as why he was there or what he was doing. And these guys were equipped in, the newest, freshest kit, the ribbons and everything, and the Ratnik system that the Russians upgraded to. And They were they had the signs of professional soldiers. They were clean. They had what we'd consider as former British soldiers, not the newest kit, but definitely very professional kit. It wasn't until the second block post it was very apparent they were some sort of Russian special forces, and their demeanor was alert but casual and relaxed and professional. They didn't raise their weapons. We had our hands raised at the time. And they carried themselves very well. They had a mixture of kit, but it was professional kit. The commander, I believe, the one that we initially spoke to, actually opened the door to my vehicle. And I'm a bit of an animal rescuer, so I had about 7 cats, 2 dogs in the car at the time. And I speak fluent Russian, and I said to him, I've got cats, I've got dogs, they're going to get out. Can you close the door? And he said, yeah, no problem. You can put your hands down. They then went on to check the trunks of our vehicles. Most of it was, all of it was people's belongings or animal food, things like this. And I believe they were, just very vaguely checking for weapons. Obviously, you had the territorial defense forces of the Ukrainian side, where some of them were fighting in civilian clothes. So they were probably looking for any signs of that. We'd marked the vehicles with white tape. Us ourselves were wearing white tape. And it seemed they were very aware that civilians would be transiting through there and making their way back on an assigned green corridor. So they were definitely more focused on the military picture and not the civilian picture. And I think that shows in most of the crimes were committed after the Russians had sort of taken those areas.
Yeah, and I apologise, Dan. I said I'd move straight on to TDI, but I just want to finish off here. So the Russians you're describing in Bucha, you said they're professional, so they're carrying themselves well. They are interacting appropriately, by the sound of it, with the civilians as far as you can see. So what happened? Because we know what then subsequently happened in Bucha and the terrible crimes that were committed. So did these units roll out? Were they replaced in Bucha by others, or what? Or do you know what happened in terms of the units?
I think it's an interesting point, because especially when I quote, what happened to me, and I try and tell the truth and what I saw and what I personally experienced, people say to me, "Oh, the Russians don't have many professional soldiers." The Orc quote, and that they've committed crimes, and we saw evidence of those crimes. Those crimes were committed in Bucha, and I was involved in the liberation of the Sumy region when the Russians left, and I'd also went back to Bucha a few days after the Russians had pulled back, and I spoke to people down there, and I think what tends to happen is obviously that situation's changed now. We're a year into the war, but at the beginning, these VDV divisions, these airborne divisions, Marines, and other professional Russian troops were spearheading these offensives. They were leading the attacks onto critical places, and they were the more professional of the Russian army. What would happen is those units would move forward and continue to focus on military objectives, and what you would have is the second and the third, fourth line of Russian troops, which is normally comprised of conscripts, people from ethnic minority regions of Russia as a widely expansive country. And these people would be more, I would say, inclined or less disciplined, less controlled, and commit these crimes.
Yes, thank you for that. So you managed to get out. So why did you come back, and what made you set up the Trident Defence Initiative? What is it? Who is it for? Why is it needed? What are you doing?
Well, I think it's key to say I've personally myself haven't left the territory of Ukraine since February the 24th. Been active in assisting the military since the beginning of the war. But there was I'd experienced it in my 3 years of service with the Ukrainian military. I'd attended exercise Seabreeze 3 times, which was a joint Ukrainian NATO exercise down in the south of Ukraine. And I had seen the sort of, including Operation Orbital as well, the British mission to Ukraine. I had seen how these missions were massively underused, and I would go as far to say, attending it 3 times myself, that especially Seabreeze was more of a PR stunt and a show of force, and it didn't really have the value to the Ukrainians that it could have had. The Ukrainian military has suffered with lots of things. The holdover from the fall of the Soviet Union, lots of Soviet practices still remain. and also, massive rapid expansions in 2014. Prior to 2014, the Ukrainians really didn't have a military. They did, in a lot of ways, lean on Russia for their defense, and also lean to the West in a lot of ways. So they had to make a massive mobilization and expansion in 2014. That continued through multiple mobilizations. And then we saw, prior to February the 24th, the creation of the Territorial Defence Forces, which I believe the initial expansion was 120,000, and it's gone up to over 250,000 now, including just general mobilizations that the Ukrainians have conducted, and the huge amount of volunteers that join the Ukrainian military. Ukraine, as a military, has definitely improved over the years, but it massively lacks standardization. It tends to try and lean towards more of a NATO standard, but it lacks that ability and that cultural change. A clean NATO standard doesn't really work for the Ukrainians. So I had said this for many years, and I took it upon myself to create this organization, which, as it stands now, is the largest within Ukraine. To really influence that standard, use my experience as a British soldier, and my knowledge of NATO military practices, and also my knowledge of the Ukrainian military and what works for them. We're seeing we're coming up to obviously very close to a year of war now, and Trident has up to this point trained just over 6,000 troops, with currently around 170 to 200 troops currently on active courses.
Brilliant, thank you. I need to take a break. Everyone's bored of hearing from me. Gaz, have you got any questions for Dan?
I certainly do. Thanks, Dom. So Dan, you've trained 6,000 members of the Ukrainian armed forces so far. In kind of broad brush terms, without giving away too much, how have you seen their training needs change over time? Is there anything that gets more or less emphasis nowadays than it did when you first began?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question. I believe that, one of the missions when I first set this up was training and equipment. That was sort of our mission, which to, provide the units we were training equipment. That mission became sort of impossible to do as our numbers got bigger and bigger. We run two-week infantry courses and 3-week team medic courses. And when you're processing, hundreds a month, it's really impossible to keep equipping them. We are a volunteer organization for the most part. And most of their needs came logistically at the beginning, lack of uniforms, lack of body armor, lack of medical kits, even lack of boots, which we saw from the Russian side as well, which you'll see from almost any military in a rapid expansion in wartime. So the needs of training have definitely changed. The need for assault training and taking territory has definitely changed as the war has stabilized a lot more in the east. We're seeing definitely still a massive emphasis on tactical medicine training and trying to reduce the casualties that the Ukrainians sustain. And we're looking at really a very uncertain time where we can't really specify our training, as we're seeing the beginnings, maybe the probings of a large offensive. We don't know where it's going to come specifically. We don't know how it's going to come. So very hard to tailor that training. A lot of it is defensive as well at the moment. The Ukrainians are pretty happy with the areas they managed to liberate prior to winter, and holding those areas, I think, is very key for Ukraine to retrain on this new Western equipment, but also to retrain on the captured Russian equipment that they managed to gain during the counter-offensives.
And that's an interesting point you raised there, Dan, about the new Western equipment that's coming on stream. How much of a difference do you see that making? Because we have a lot of chatter and speculation over here, certainly the non-specialist side of things, about what difference it could make and how many and what effect it will have. But from your perspective as somebody on the inside of the training and delivery pipeline there, what sort of a difference is it going to make, do you think?
I think we have those sort of crown jewel weapons that fill the internet space, the meme space. Your javelins, HIMARS, things like that. But really, the weapons that make a difference, I think, are the amassing amounts of armored fighting vehicles. We've recently seen the Bradleys and the Strikers being offered to Ukraine. The tanks, I think, will make a great difference in regards to spearheading offensives to take back Ukrainian territory. So I think that a lot of the equipment that is overshadowed, that doesn't get spoken about, makes definitely more of an impact. Things like HIMARS make specific area impacts, but those mass givens of equipment do make a big difference. I think Dom spoke about it at the beginning with the missile strikes that happened early this morning into the morning. I personally experienced them. It woke me up 4 a.m. to to a large number of missiles hitting Kharkiv very close to us. But we see a massive difference with the air defense. I think 61 out of 71 missiles were shot down today. And that is a massive, massive difference from where we were in the first 6 months of the war, when I think the Ukrainians' success rate in shooting down missiles was 20%. And then very suddenly it jumped up massively, which was a clear sign that those Western air defense systems were now operating in Ukraine. Unfortunately for myself and people in areas like Zaporizhia, we are predominantly targeted by S-300 missiles, which as of now, and I don't see that changing anytime soon, are impossible to shoot down with air defense.
Cool. Thank you very much for that valuable inside perspective there, Dan. And I will now hand back to Dom for the final segment.
Thanks, Gaz. Dan, so you're in Kharkiv right now, and you had strikes last night, as you've just described, strikes that hit across the whole country. Can you just paint us a picture of what the mood is like? Kharkiv, Ukraine's sickened city. I mean, what is day-to-day life like there? How are people responding to the air raid alarms? Is there any sense of thinking about after, later? Are people making plans for the future? What's day-to-day life like in Kharkiv?
Well, I give, especially for the viewers, not many people have heard of the city of Kharkiv as opposed to Kiev, Lviv, and the other famous cities. Kharkiv sits very, very close to the Russian border. On the north side of the city of Kharkiv, you're looking at 20 kilometers and even less to the Russian border, specifically the Belgorod region. I first came to Kharkiv around 6-7 months ago. It's been our main training location since then. And I've seen a massive change in the city. When I first came here, the Russians were still surrounding the city. They were 5-6 kilometers from our positions at the time. And they were using conventional artillery means to shell the city, even the center. Excuse me. So they were hitting it with, MLRS artillery. And as the counteroffensive happened, the frequency of those strikes, dropped massively. But the Russians kept up those bombardments of S-300s. I think you mentioned it before, but around October time, our base was actually struck while we were there by 5 S-300s. And in the recent weeks, around 2 weeks ago, one of our accommodations was hit, and thankfully nobody was injured from our side. But you're seeing a massive difference to the other cities. Kharkiv went through a very similar experience to Kiev and Chernihiv. It was effectively almost surrounded. And the Ukrainians were managed to hold the Russians back and push them out of conventional artillery range. And now the city has seen an almost return to life. The people are coming back through necessity more than anything. They need to continue to work. They need to continue to fuel the economy, and obviously a need to be home, to be closer to their loved ones. But the city is under constant bombardment, far more than the more western cities, which creates a precarious situation for us. But as military instructors, it sort of pays dividends to be closer to the troops that are on the front line that need it.
Thanks, Dan. And just final question, if I may. Any old muckers from the Princess of Wales Royal Regiment got in touch with you? What are they saying to you? Do they always think that you'd end up doing something like this, or what are they suggesting to you?
Well, I've been in this realm of work and in conflict zones for over 10 years now, so it's definitely not my first hurrah, and I'd say it's arguably definitely not my last hurrah. So yeah, I think they're interested, they're keen, and it goes to show, I wasn't myself. I believe you were, an officer and stuff. I wasn't that, and I didn't have those positions of command and things. But what I do have is a history in Ukraine, a grasp of the language, and a clear-cut view of what the Ukrainians need, how they need it, and how to best deliver it to them. And that's what we've been trying to do for the last, so it's very difficult to say, but the last year. It doesn't feel like a year, but it's almost a year now.
Well, Dan, thanks so much indeed for coming on today to explain that. Absolutely fascinating stuff. We wish you well, and we will stay in touch and no doubt speak again. But thank you so much for your time.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
I just want to finish off today's pod by just talking about the last couple of days and where I was. So I was due. So when did we last week? Tuesday, I think. And I said not going to be here for the next couple of days. Blah blah blah. Can't say where and all that kind of jazz. So I was heading to Rome with the Defence Secretary, and the Foreign Secretary was out there to the Pontignano conference, which is an annual thing. It's a big bilat UK, Italy. It's a defence and security, culture, business, big old melange of worthies for a couple of days, and it works really well. Apparently, you get all the right people in the right rooms for a short space of time, have a load of pasta, and everything's dandy. So that was what we were heading out for. And then as I was heading out to RAF Northolt, which is just on the western side of London, an RAF base here, to fly out, the news broke that President Zelensky was coming to town. So I thought, right, well, that's our trip, cancelled. There's no way Ben Wallace is not going to want to be in London if President Zelensky is here. So I was fully expecting it to be cancelled. There was also very thick fog around West London on Wednesday morning. So I'm at Northolt. I'm just sort of kicking my heels, looking at the RAF uniforms and all the beards everyone's wearing these days, and thinking it's all going to be off. And turns out, no, it's still on. President Zelensky flew to Stansted. Now, it turns out that he was due, the RAF C-17 aircraft that brought him into the country was supposed to land at Northolt, and then he was going to do a brush past, quick hello with me and Ben Wallace, probably more interested in one than the other, and then he was going to head off. But the fog, he flew to Stansted, so we headed out, and we saw as the day wore on, all these messages about the speech and the talking about fighter jets and so on and so forth. We were getting these bits of news in real time, the same as everyone else in the world. And so it was very interesting for me as a, one step to the right hand side of history kind of bloke as a journalist, to watch what happens there when the snow dome has been shaken. And boy, was it shaken. So I think President Zelensky played an absolute blinder. Okay, he came to UK and framed the narrative as if the whole thing about donation of fighter jets was a done deal. I mean, his final words as he left the British Parliament, having addressed Parliament, was "Thank you in advance for your powerful English planes." I mean, not English, the British, German, Italian, and Spanish. So, but hey, never mind that bit. But thank you in advance for your planes. I mean, certainly presumptuous and a little bit cheeky, I have to say. I mean, coming here and saying thanks for your planes before you've even got them. But he framed the whole narrative as, look, let's not get down and dirty in the details of who's going to donate what where. Look, this is clearly going to happen. Now let's just talk about what it means and where we go from here and all the rest of it. And he framed the debate that way. And then it's very, very difficult, well, as we saw, I think impossible for the Prime Minister, to say, hang on a minute, mate. No, we're not giving you any plays. What are you talking about? He couldn't do it. So obviously, Rishi Sunak, as the genial host, has to sort of make comments like, well, yeah, we'll look at that. We'll see what we can do. Every assistant, all this kind of stuff, which is lapped up and amplified, of course. Why wouldn't you? By President Zelensky and the Ukrainian authorities. And we're in Rome listening to all this. And I'm not going to tell tales out of school about some of the private conversations I had with Ben Wallace, but he was saying, well, we're having these conversations. We've always said nothing is off the table. Nothing is on the table. No decisions have been met. We're constantly looking at what we can offer, what the demand signal is from Ukraine, what is the art of the possible with our allies. So there were somewhat sort of, if not mixed messages, then understandably slightly confused messages, because London was getting all excited, and Rishi Sunak was having his moment in the sun, and fair play to him, and President Zelensky is pushing it for all it's worth. So we were getting these messages come through to Rome about this idea that Britain would then look to see what it can supply, specifically within the context of fighter jets. So this then turns into the MOD will investigate what it can send, which then about an hour later turned into Number 10 has ordered the MOD to investigate what jets it could send. So the whole narrative was utterly skewed, was being driven. Well, I mean, Zelensky was well ahead of it, and then everyone else was playing catch up on this narrative. And I was with Ben Wallace saying, but hang on, nothing's changed. We are constantly doing this. We're always evaluating what we can offer, when, what kind of capacity, what's the downstream effect, what impact does it have on our allies, what's the politics. And it was absolutely fascinating to see this narrative unfolding in real time. I was trying to report the facts as I see them, and give my view of them to the paperback here. We were getting stuff up online, and I was just trying to, if not hang on to the tail of the tiger, but certainly stroke the tiger's ears and say, hang on, let's slow down a sec. We're not giving any jets. That's simply not going to happen. For for fear that we, the Telegraph, would look a bit daft if there wasn't an announcement in the next press conference about delivering jets. But there was such a fervour here in London by that stage that it was really quite it was quite a fraught atmosphere on the where are we now Wednesday afternoon. So it was fascinating to see global politics play out, to see departmental politics play out over in real time over social media, and as breaking news sort of hit our smartphones and what have you. But it was all, as I say, I think it all driven, by President Zelensky, just framing the debate as in we had this over tanks, we had this over HIMARS, we had this over air defence, the no, oh, go on then. And he was just saying, look, it's going to happen. We're going to get to the oh, go on then bit with fighters, so let's just move on from there. And it was fascinating to see. I've rambled on enough. We've been going on for long enough. I can see David and Francis still lurking, so I'm going to get told off for going over time. So we will draw it to a halt there. But these little snippets, I will tell you what I can when I can. But like I say, I won't tell tales out of school because then I won't be invited back later. But it's just fascinating to see global politics playing out in real time and being if not a bystander, but certainly just to the right hand side of history over there at the back, holding a little glass of something nice. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to the podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. You can also contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells, Neve Robinson and Giles Gear. And today on Twitter, Rachel Duffy.